Hi, my name is Chuck McDonald, and I founded Chrysilla, which is a small business consulting company that works with business owners to enhance the value of their business and help them create a legacy over time. Today, what I wanted to do was to talk a little bit about the federal budget, which might sound like I'm going to get a little wonky, which I might. But with the passage of recent legislation, I think one of the things that we talk about is the federal debt and the federal deficit. And those are things that seem to be very, very abstract concepts. And there's an awful lot of misinformation that you might see in the press. And so I'm just here to break it down into real numbers. A, mostly because I'm pretty passionate about this. And B, I think it's important for people to understand the reality of the situation. So let's just talk about the reality of the federal budget. And I'm going to refer to some notes over here. So in 2023, the federal government spent about $6.1 trillion. And I think in 2024, that went up to about 6.7. All right, so how is that broken down? 2/3 of that is what we call mandatory spending. Social Security, Medicare, Medicaid, those three things. And I know that there were some Medicaid cuts thrown into the last budget bill of a few $100 billion. We'll see how that actually shakes out. But you think about this, so 2/3 of that is mandated by the government. About $1 trillion, I'm going to call it $1 trillion, but it's a little less. It's about, the last official number was $885 billion is interest on the federal debt. So in order to keep going, the federal government borrows money, but they have to pay interest on the people who actually have purchased that debt. So if I can do this, I can walk in or I can go online and I can buy U.S. Treasuries, and when those interest payments come in, that comes out of the budget. The trick is that for a number of years, at least for the last 25 or 26 years or so, the government has spent more money than it's made. And so the way that we keep spending is to borrow more money. So currently, there is about $37 trillion of debt outstanding. And there's a really cool website. It's called debtclock.org. And it kind of actually shows how big that is and how much it's growing. So the government just relies on being able to keep borrowing money to be able to do this. So if we go back and look, so that was interest on the debt. The remainder is what we call discretionary. So when Congress starts talking about budget cuts and things like that, it's supposed to come out of this discretionary bucket because you have to pay interest on the debt. That's kind of required. And the mandatory stuff, Social Security, Medicare, Medicaid, is actually called mandatory for a reason because they have to pay it. All right. So the discretionary piece of it, about half of that is defense. So of the 23% or so of the budget in 23, you're looking at defense, which is about 13% of the total budget. So, and a lot of people like to spend money on defense. So the rest of it, it's about 15% of the total budget that's actually, you've got some wiggle room. All right. So 6.7 trillion in spending. Go into my notes. Revenues, 4.9 trillion. Okay, so it's about a $1.8 trillion shortfall. And you can do the math and kind of say, if we completely spent zero on all discretionary spending, we would still be running a deficit. So just kind of looking at some of the major categories, individual income tax makes up about half of that, 49%. Payroll tax, which you pay to fund Social Security, is about 35% of that. Corporate income tax is 11%. Excise tax, customs duties, and other amount to about 6%. Okay. So, and I'm going to make a note about tariffs here because that is a potential line item. So I looked it up, and the potential income from tariffs, keeping in mind that we really jacked them up is about $250 billion potentially this year. Now, remember what I said. Interest on the debt is 885 trillion or 885 billion. Sorry, that would be really crazy. So the 250 billion this year wouldn't even come close. Well, it would fund about a little more than a quarter of interest payments that the U.S. government has to pay. And they've actually said that potentially we could make about $3 trillion over 10 years. Okay. But I just thinking about the magnitude of the issue, $3 trillion over 10 years, let's just average it out and say you're going to make $300 billion a year. Last year's deficit, the spending in excess of revenues, was $1.5 to $1.8 trillion. So you got that. So it's anybody who's actually saying that tariffs can be a source of reducing or eliminating the income tax it ain't going to happen. It's wishful thinking. And this is not a political comment. This is a math comment. And the funny thing about math is that it works. It's exact. The other thing about tariffs is that if the administration is able to make good on what they want to do with tariffs, which is basically to bring more manufacturing onshore, a noble pursuit, that's actually going to reduce your tariff revenue. So it's a little bit of a double-edged sword. So how have governments in the past dealt with large fiscal deficits? Well, basically there's 4 ways that any sort of government can deal with a large deficit and kind of start to dig themselves out of the hole, just like a household would. The first thing is you can grow your way out of it. You can make more money. Okay. Well, the idea is that a lot of this, lower regulations and things like that can increase economic activity, which it certainly could. And if you get more economic activity, then you get more tax revenue, then you get more income amongst the population, the economy grows, and that in and of itself actually creates more money to pay down the debt. Awesome. That is obviously the preferred method for any politician. The second thing that you can do is some measure of austerity, basically meaning you're going to spend less and or raise taxes. Now, I heard it somewhere that a politician's primary job is to get reelected. Politicians don't get reelected by promising less and telling them that they're going to charge you more for it. So, and given that we have an incumbent re-election rate in Congress of around 96%, they seem to have been doing a good job of staying away from that austerity thing. And I don't really see anything that would cause that to change. All right. The third thing that a government can do to deal with excessive debt is inflation. Also very unpopular. We had a bout of it at the end of the last administration where basically there was a lot of money being thrust into the system and people were spending it. And so inflation is really just too many dollars chasing too few goods. Law of supply and demand. When demand for something goes up, then the price has to come up to basically, just because of supply and demand and the way that works. But inflation can be helpful when it comes for debt. And I kind of think of it this way. Let's say that you buy a house and you take out a 30-year mortgage. And let's say the first payment that you make on that house is $3,000. And it's a percentage of your income and a percentage of your livelihood or your resources that you have. 30 years down the road when you make that last payment, assuming that wages and the price level of everything else have gone up, even the value of your house has gone up, that $3,000 isn't going to feel like $3,000 like it does today. And so that's why governments tend to maybe enjoy inflation a little bit more than consumers do. Because if you're highly indebted, that is certainly one way mathematically to cushion the blow. So ideally, the interest on all this debt that they've taken on, it's fixed rate for the most part. And the idea is if the government floats a 30-year treasury, the interest payments that they're having to make on that 30-year down the road just aren't going to feel very big compared to where they are today. So inflating their way out of the debt is one way to deal with that. The last thing, which everybody would really love to see, is some sort of a default or restructuring. And that, it's the thing that the U.S. government has going for it is that they have taxing authority and a printing press. Now, the printing press causes inflation, but conceivably they can tax enough to ensure that they make good on their obligations. And that's why, despite some of the credit downgrades that the U.S. has actually received in the recent past, they're still considered to be the risk-free rate, the ironclad credit amongst the world. So if the U.S. government decided that they just weren't going to make good on those obligations anymore, that would be a real problem. Something about the likes that hasn't been seen in centuries, if ever. All right. So that's a little bit about the federal deficit, the federal debt. Check out debtclock.org if you're curious about this. Certainly some good information in there. And I think, one of the things that I always think about is, we talk about this deficit, this debt, this $37 trillion that the government owes to whoever owns the bonds. It's kind of hard to make a connection between how that impacts somebody. And the truth of the matter is that it might not be impacting anybody today. In fact, the stock market seems to be appreciating the fact that we are borrowing more to generate, ideally, some economic activity. But eventually, that will have to be paid. And we'll see how that happens. All right. On that happy note, this is Chuck McDonald. I'm with Priscilla, and I've got a small business consulting firm that I work with business owners to help create lasting legacy and increasing asset values for their business. Thanks for watching.